Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. We are delighted to have you here. My name is Annette Bernhardt. I direct the Technology and Work program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. Today, we are very excited to be joined by this incredible set of experts in talking with you about data and algorithms in the workplace. Specifically, we will be talking about the trend in a wide range of industries where employers are increasingly collecting worker data and using electronic monitoring and algorithmic management with potentially significant effects on workers. You will hear more from me later, but I wanted to share with you what our goal is with this webinar, which is really to lift up the fact that these new technologies are a workers' rights issue. As you know, we are having a critical national conversation right now about consumers and social media users and their technology rights, whether it's about the impact of fake news on our democracy or the selling of our data by tech companies. And of course, most recently, we've seen the release of the Facebook papers, which has foregrounded the power and opacity of the algorithms that many platforms use. And these are absolutely critical discussions. But we also need to talk about workers. The workplace is a major site for the implementation of data-driven technologies. And that means that workers have just as big stakes around this tech as consumers and social media users do. Whether it's about racial and gender bias in hiring algorithms, or productivity systems that push workers to the point of injury, or gig platforms that use automated management and firing. Workers deserve a robust set of rights and protections around these powerful and often untested technologies, especially the workers of color, women, and immigrants who are most likely to work in the low-wage industries where these technologies are seeing rapid adoption. So we are deeply grateful for everyone participating today, and especially I want to thank Assemblywoman Gonzalez, who has been a leading advocate on the issues that workers are facing in the 21st century workplace. And at this point, I will turn things over to our moderator, Caitlin Vega, who herself is a tireless advocate for worker rights.
Thank you, Annette. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be your moderator today. In terms of our agenda, we are very excited to have Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez, who will be kicking off our event. Then we'll have two panels. The first is a panel of worker representatives who will be talking about how data-driven technology is showing up in different industries and at work sites and how that impacts workers. Then we'll have a second panel to focus on why current laws are not enough to protect workers and the policy principles of the rights that workers need and deserve when it comes to new technologies. We'll end with a short Q&A. You can find a Q&A window on the right-hand side of your Zoom. Feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar, but we'll go ahead and answer them at the end. Also, because we have a packed program, we're going to paste a link with the full bios in the chat and not discuss them as we introduce our wonderful panels. Now we'll go ahead and get started. We are thrilled to be joined by Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez. There is no elected leader in California who has done more to advance the rights, particularly of the most vulnerable workers across our economy, whether it's fighting wage theft, misclassification, sexual harassment and sexual assault at the workplace, and most recently, authoring AB 701 to address the rise in algorithmic management and the impact on health and safety of warehouse workers. This is the perfect person to kick off this panel and this webinar about the need for new technology rights for workers. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. And Caitlin did not say on all those things that I worked on. I think she has probably been by my side on most of them, if not all of those bills, and getting them through the legislature. So we've had a great working relationship over the years, and I appreciate that, like so many people on this webinar. But I was thinking as I was about this subject, and I was thinking about how my last couple of bills that really dealt with algorithms, when they first came to me, or when we first started talking about them, it was in a traditional workplace issue, right? It was, for example, with 701, that was our warehouse worker bill. It was workers getting injured on the job. I've done a lot on workers' compensation. I've done a lot about workers getting injured on the job. And that is, in my mind, the first thing I thought about. And then as we're working on it, you realize that so much of this is caused by the fact that they're being managed not by human beings, really, but by the algorithm, right? And so, when we talked about AB5 previously with drivers and rideshare drivers, again, we're talking about misclassification, just a traditional labor subject, which has been made worse or is able to be capitalized on more because of technology. And so, it took me almost, I think, half the year when I started getting all these tech reporters calling me to really think about it from the tech perspective. So I'm so grateful that this is going on, because in my mind, of course, as a former organizer and labor leader, it was workers are getting hurt. Why are they getting hurt? Why are they being pushed too hard? What can we do about it? And how do they report it? How do you stop retaliation without the broader vision of what is tech doing in our workplace? And I want to be clear, because tech in the workplace, my daughter is 25 years old and she works for Netflix. And we were just talking about this at breakfast the other morning. It's not all bad. And I don't think even as people who care about workers' rights thinks it's all bad. She was explaining to me, she works in animation, and she was explaining to me how animators' jobs have become so much easier, if you will. It's not easy at all, but she was explaining how they used to have to animate pictures compared to how they can now with the technology that's available. So obviously, sometimes technology makes things much easier, makes workers, yes, more productive, but just incredible opportunities for workers as well. So our question is twofold, really. What are those privacy protections that we need to ensure so often that workers have no idea or even existence? Sometimes they may not even know they're being monitored. And then how do we embrace technology from a worker standpoint in ways that can make jobs easier and better for the worker as well? So I think we always have to kind of have that perspective on it moving through, because we obviously aren't anti-technology. We don't want to be seen as not wanting things to advance. We do. There are so many things that could make it helpful. And further, I will say, once we really figure out, and I learned this from actually our rideshare drivers who self-organize through an app, is how do we use technology to help workers actually advocate for their own rights as well. So it's multifold, but first we have to talk about the dangers, quite frankly, and what is happening in the workplace, and often happening without the consent or knowledge of the worker. And I think that that's vital. And so I'm glad that this is being put together, that we're talking about something that really intersects between work, the future of work, as we like to say, and concentrates on the future of the worker, because you can't talk about technology and the future of work without talking about how this will affect the future of that worker. And so thank you to the UC Berkeley Labor Center for putting this on. Thank you all for caring about this subject. It is, for those old schoolers like me, it is absolutely the same things we have been talking about time and time again: safety on the job, being hurt on the job, whether or not you can take breaks adequately, whether things are being logged in adequately, how much personal autonomy you still have as a worker. It's all those traditional things, fighting for workers to have rights. And on top of that, how technology interplays with that. So thank you so much for bringing it up. And I look forward to the discussion, hearing more. And the question I get asked every day, especially by the tech sector, is what are you going to do next as far as technology and work? And I don't know. And so, I'm here to hear, to learn, and to see how we can continue to protect workers given kind of the new era we're in. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Thanks so much for making the time to be here with us today. We're going to turn now to our first panel to talk about what we're seeing, what kinds of technology we're seeing in the workplace. Our wonderful panel include many of the leading thinkers on these issues, on both the challenges and the opportunities with the emerging technologies. many people don't know what technologies, as Assemblymember Gonzalez mentioned, many workers don't know what technologies are being used. Many of us here as advocates and policymakers, legislative staff, also don't know. And so we really look forward to hearing from these experts about what they're seeing to help inform the kind of work we want to do next. And we will start it off with Cynthia Gomez as Senior Research Analyst at Unite Here Local 2.
Good morning, everyone. So it's great to be here. I'm a little nervous at being the first person, but I'm just going to plow on through. So as Caitlin introduced, I'm a senior research analyst with Unite Here Local 2. Before the pandemic, our union had 300,000 workers throughout the United States and Canada. So if you've ever stayed in a hotel, eaten a meal at an airport restaurant or on an airplane, gone to a casino, gone to an event with banquet servers, then you may have interacted with one of our members or their work. Our members fight like hell for their jobs to be good jobs with healthcare, a living wage, dignity on the job, and which includes the ability to fight for a safer workload. Our members are also overwhelmingly immigrants, women, people of color, and it will, of course, surprise no one that this group is the most likely to see its work impacted by what we're talking about today. Apps and technology that dictate workloads, work schedules, work rates, work methods, and at cost to the workers themselves. And for hospitality workers, all of this is in the context of an industry that is increasingly chasing higher profits. To quote one of their leaders, "You don't want to let a good crisis go to waste." And now cutting services, working our members even harder and keeping the profits. And yes, the crisis they were referring to is the pandemic that has killed 5 million people worldwide in less than 2 years. So the dominant conception of what work is considered skilled and what isn't is less about the amount of skill itself and more a reflection of who is doing that work and what value they are assigned as human beings. I don't remember who I'm quoting here, but picking a single head of lettuce doesn't necessarily take skill. Picking hundreds of heads of lettuce an hour for 8 hours a day, that takes skill. So turning to our members, I'm going to take one example of many, hotel housekeeping, and one example of one kind of technology that she may have to deal with. If you ask a housekeeper, and in the gendered world of labor, it's almost always she will tell you that she has to learn how to manage her job in a way that is the most efficient, the least stressful, and most importantly, the least damaging to her body in a context where hotel housekeepers have some of the highest rates of workplace injury among private sector workers. So she might tell you that a stayover room with a single business traveler is less work than a family of 4 checking out after a week. She might prefer to do stayover rooms first because guests appreciate being able to come back to their room. She's going to look at her workload for each day and figure out what she needs to do and when. Add into this picture that she's pushing a cart weighing possibly hundreds of pounds through thick pile carpet that was put in place because it looks and it feels luxurious, but that definitely makes it harder to push a heavy cart through. And there's no time for me to really get into this greenwashing scam that hotels have, some hotels have, called the Green Choice Program or different variations of it. But I'll say that if her hotel uses that scam, she may also have rooms that haven't been cleaned in days, but she's given no more additional time to clean them. So into that, enter an app whose only goal is maximizing efficiency, except it's not the way she would define it, nor is it in her interest. Now she has to wear a device or download an app on her phone that was designed without her input, not to mention her consent, by someone who has never done her job, but seems to think they know how to do it even better than she does. Her boss is now an app, and it tells her which rooms she'll clean in which order, dictated by an algorithm's idea of what makes sense, or maybe a promise that was made to a VIP guest. The app may only make assignments 1 or 2 rooms at a time, making it impossible for her to plan her day. So the effect is that she may be made to travel all over the hotel to multiple floors, pushing that heavy cart. In Las Vegas, one housekeeper that we surveyed reported that she had to change floors 4 different times and went to 3 different wings of an enormous hotel in a single day. It's also not just the physical strain on her body. Her autonomy is being taken away. And to add insult to literal injury, the app is dictating her workday to her in a language that she may not even read, because our members come from around the world and speak dozens of languages. The way that these apps work is by ultimately treating the housekeeper's own body as just another piece of technology. Again, to repeat the report's conclusion, technology isn't inherently good or bad, nor is it neutral. The key question is who is using it and for what? Imagine a technology designed for working people, defining efficiency as what allows their work to be safer, less stressful, better paid. But housekeepers are not the end users of these apps. They are not the end users of this technology. They are the ones who are being made to deploy it. The real end users of these apps and this technology are the ones whose CEO pay, whose investor profits are soaring, and this wealth is built literally on the backs of working women. In 2018, our union began a campaign to gain bargaining rights over new technology. And to be clear, our employers didn't want us to have those rights. In Las Vegas, it took a strike vote by 25,000 workers before the company would settle on the issue. Later that year, it took a strike of 10,000 hotel workers across 7 cities to win those rights. Our workers understand the importance of the issue and they were willing to fight for it. We got advance notification, the right to negotiate over new technology, requirements for job training, and severance if a worker loses their job because of technology. So because of these fights in 2018, housekeepers and other workers are at the table discussing how these technologies should be used. The pandemic has slowed down our work, but we have made some real gains for workers. And that came about because we organized workers to fight for the future of their work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Next, we'll go to John Marshall, Senior Capital Markets Analyst with the USCW.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's really an honor to be here as part of this amazing panel. And I really appreciate the UC Berkeley Labor Center for bringing us together to have this discussion this morning. Just listening to my sister, Cynthia Gomez from Unite here, I realized how many common themes there are in the way these issues are playing out among our members. So again, this report is really, really critical. And in our sector, it's coming at a really important time because technology investments are really, really ramping up right now. In particular, I really want to call out that while this report provides a very clear set of warnings about the consequences of new technologies in the workplace, it does not get caught up in the hype of a lot of the technology producers. And I think that's often a mistake that many of us make when we start to look at these intimidating technologies. As the report makes clear, most of the so-called automation and artificial intelligence technologies rely heavily on human labor. Now, I'm going to try to illustrate this point with 2 examples from the food retail sector, where the UFCW represents over 700,000 workers across the United States. The first technology I'd like to discuss is one that I think is familiar to everyone. It's the self-checkout scanner. Like a lot of so-called automation technology, self-checkout is not labor-saving automation at all. In reality, it's labor shifting automation. It's technology that adds work for customers and is slower than traditional staffed checkout lanes. For cashiers, it's actually resulted in an intensification of work. Why? As supermarkets have added self-checkout machines, they have cut the number of cashiers, leaving the remaining cashiers to oversee anywhere from 4 to 8 self-checkout lanes simultaneously. In addition to the productivity targets that exist in traditional checkout lanes, there's also a very big focus on deterring theft. And that's the other dirty secret about self-checkout technology. For what I think are obvious reasons, perhaps, they are closely associated with increases in shoplifting, or what the industry euphemistically calls inventory shrinkage. So for decades, there has been significant video surveillance inside grocery stores, but as self-checkout technology has expanded, the use of computer vision technology to monitor customers and workers has expanded dramatically as well. I could say a whole lot more about surveillance in the stores. It's an inherent part of self-checkout technology. And in fact, it's the actual basis of other new checkout technologies, such as Amazon Go, for example. But the point I want to make now is that the expansion of self-checkout technology has forced human cashiers to manage a much more challenging, higher stress environment that this so-called automation has created. So reading customers' body language, de-escalating potential conflicts, multitasking, all while remaining friendly and cheerful. This requires significant skill, specifically the usually unacknowledged skills of communication and emotional intelligence. I want to pause here and emphasize that a highly relevant fact is that in the United States, 75% of cashiers are women. In this way, the so-called automation of self-checkout relies on the gender division of labor and the undervaluing of women's skills, even as this labor is being intensified. So I'm going to shift gears now and talk about a different technology, and that is the infamous, the notorious gig management platforms, notorious GIG, as I like to call them. The proliferation of smartphone technology has allowed firms to increase control over workers and the work process while simultaneously permitting the appearance of an arm's length relationship. In the grocery sector, there are a range of companies backed by billions of dollars in venture capital funding, Instacart, DoorDash, Uber Eats, that are doing exactly that. Workers at these companies do exactly the same jobs as tens of thousands of UFCW grocery members working in e-commerce fulfillment. In fact, both sets of workers are using app-based algorithmic task management systems. Both sets of workers are working significant regular hours. As this report notes, app-based management systems permit companies to direct work with a high degree of control, setting productivity targets, allocating and directing work assignments, and in the case of the gig management platforms, determining pay. I call them app-based management systems because that's exactly what they are. But it's a management system that's totally opaque to the worker with no due process and no accountability. So because of their lower costs, the gig management platforms have an unfair advantage compared to employers who play by the rules. In the grocery sector, most union chains are now outsourcing significant parts of their business to these gig firms, replacing workers who are currently classified as employees and who are members of the UFCW. Of course, the gig companies claim that workers don't want and don't need basic employment rights, and that they value a vaguely defined concept of flexibility above all else. But independent studies have repeatedly shown most of the labor provided on these platforms is done by workers working full-time or significant part-time hours. For example, there's a recent study by McKinsey that found that an overwhelming majority of contingent workers would prefer to have permanent employment, and this preference was highest among immigrants and workers of color, groups that are significantly overrepresented on the app-based platforms. So right now, the gig companies have a near complete monopoly on the data that would allow individual workers and regulators the ability to evaluate these claims. The gig companies have refused to share this data with workers, not only because it gives them an advantage with those individual workers, but because it allows them to mischaracterize, misclassify, and undervalue their workforces in general. When workers, legal advocates, or regulators seek to gain access to this data, the companies shed crocodile tears about worker and consumer privacy. So in conclusion, as the report says, enforcement is the lifeblood of laws and regulations. Without it, the promise of legal rights is hollow. Workers, worker organizations, and regulators must be able to proactively audit these algorithms. If we don't, then misclassification will become the norm for low-wage workers across a whole range of sectors. That's why this report, again, by the UC Berkeley Labor Center is really, really critical right now, because it makes the case that any new rules must be embedded in the labor and employment law system. Privacy cannot be used as an excuse to permit employers to maintain a monopoly on information and power. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. We're going to go now to Amanda Steele, Deputy Policy Director of SEIU Local 2015.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here to talk about these important issues. I am the Deputy Policy Director at SEIU Local 2015. We are the largest long-term care local in the country, and we represent over 400,000 long-term care workers, and that includes in-home supportive services, which is our IHSS or home care workers, as well as nursing home workers across skilled nursing facilities throughout the state. And so the majority of our workforce is made up of women and people of color. And, in listening to the previous two panelists, I see a lot of, similarities in the workforce makeup of our membership. And so our home care members in particular are caring for people in their homes that are Medicaid eligible, and they're helping them with their most intimate tasks. So things like feeding, bathing, taking them to medical appointments, really the most intimate personal tasks that a person needs help with to stay, safe in their home. That's what our home care workers are doing. It's incredibly physically demanding, it's emotionally demanding, and a lot of times it's very much undervalued. I think there's a common misconception about what that work entails and just how challenging and draining it really can be. So I just wanted to first talk a little bit about the electronic visit verification system, or EVV, which is the system that is directly impacting IHSS workers. Back in 2016, there was a federal bill that was passed called the Cures Act. And it included a lot of great things, and advancements in healthcare research around cancer treatments and mental illness, really important things. It did also include the electronic visit verification, EVV requirements. And so what that meant was that if any state had a Medicaid-based home care program, they would have to put in place an electronic visit verification system by 2019 in order to keep receiving their full amount of federal Medicaid funding. And so what that meant was that for those states with the Medicaid-based home care programs, they had to put in place a system that would essentially track the work of those home care providers. So where they were doing their work, the tasks that they were doing, how long they were spending on them. There was an implication that GPS tracking should be a part of that, or something that was very specific that showed where exactly they were at every moment of their workday. And so, when this system came about, it did raise a lot of concerns throughout the IHSS provider and the consumer community. First and foremost, of course, there were privacy concerns about having their exact location tracked down to the hour of their day, which, in prior to this, there were really no issues with having to, report your time if you were a home care worker. It's pretty straightforward. You start your day, you're in someone's home, or if it's your family member that you live with, it's in your own home. So it's pretty straightforward. You're doing your work, you're allocated a certain number of hours to care for that person, and that's kind of it. So this was really brand new to our home care system here in California. And what we had seen is, we started looking at other states that had already done similar EVV systems prior to the federal legislation. And what we saw in places like Ohio was that those systems tended to have the much more invasive technologies that really utilize that GPS tracking and required you to maybe clock in and out at every single task. So say you assisted your consumer with feeding them or preparing their breakfast, you would clock in when you start that task and then clock in when you stop. So you can imagine that could become very burdensome and could potentially interrupt the care that they're giving. We also saw that there were instances in other states where the care hours would actually be reduced because they were being tracked so closely. Those technologies would be used to say, well, you could have done this task faster, or you wasted time here, or something like that. And that's kind of how the system was really messaged, was as this great thing that would combat all this apparent fraud that was happening in home care, which of course, knowing the workforce and knowing what home care workers are subjected to and how they've been devalued over the years and dealt with low wages and having to fight for basic worker protections like overtime and sick pay, we knew that this was just another way to kind of mischaracterize the workforce and create a problem that really didn't exist. So when this federal EVV requirement came about, we knew that it was only a matter of time that California was going to have to comply with it or risk losing Medicaid funding. So our members, along with other long-term care advocacy groups, really banded together to make sure that we had certain protections in place with the EVV system that we knew was going to be coming in California. So in 2018, through the budget, we were able to secure a number of protections for our home care workers and the consumers. We were able to codify that there would be no GPS tracking, no reduction of hours, that the new system would be integrated seamlessly with the existing electronic timesheet system. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be this completely brand new system that all of a sudden people were going to have to use and completely change the way that they had been doing timesheets for years and years. So we were fortunate to be able to get many protections in place. Additionally, the EVV system ended up being delayed until January of 2020. So that gave states more time to kind of work through the process of implementing, a safer system and a system that was less invasive. And in California, that meant we really embraced the stakeholder process and making sure we were involving both providers and consumers in the conversations with the state to really voice like what it meant to be a worker and deal with this day in and day out and what they wanted to see in a system like EVV. So we really want to, continue to make sure that those protections stay in place, because we know that, over the last couple of years, we have the federal government has, said from time to time that they're revising the requirements a little bit, or, there's been questions of like, is this what the state put into place, like in compliance? So now that we're, been in a new federal administration, we know that at any time things can change, and, those requirements may be updated or potentially made more stringent. So we want to continue to make sure that those protections that we've won stay in place. We also want to make sure that, not only in California, but in other states, that any home care worker doesn't have to worry about, being subjected to like any of these like privacy issues, the GPS tracking, or potentially having their hours reduced, because it's not just about California. There's home care workers all throughout the nation that are dealing with this, and states are, you know, implementing systems in different ways. And so we want to, you know, advocate for home care workers throughout the country, not just here. And again, we want to make sure that we are serving as the model in California, as, you know, lifting up home care workers for the work that they do, valuing the work that they do and recognizing it. You know, they're taking care of our family members, our community members, they're keeping people out of institutions, and, you know, they're doing it all for, you know, not the highest wages. So we know that they're doing incredible work, and that, you know, putting a system in place that could potentially bring about any of these privacy issues or tracking is just, you know, we want to completely avoid that and make sure that we're continuing to advocate for this workforce here and in other states. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Amanda. We're going to go now to Sheheryar Kaoosji, the Executive Director of the Warehouse Worker Resource Center.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm Sheheryar Kaoosji, Executive Director of the Warehouse Worker Resource Center. We are an organization based in Southern California. We organize warehouse workers in the non-union warehouses of Southern California, the supply chain of the big retailers across the country. Our motto and focus is organizing through education, advocacy, and action. What we're focused on is building power among those workers who, you know, work under really, really dire conditions in the supply chains of some of the biggest companies in the world, including companies like Amazon, Walmart, and Home Depot. We saw that these workers have power to change the economy, that they're strategically positioned to have a massive impact on the economy. But in fact, warehousing has been for decades an unregulated laboratory for capital innovation in things like worker control, union busting, community breaking, and generally perfecting neoliberal racial capitalism. Surveillance and algorithmic management are two key parts of this, but not all of it. You should also know that the workers in this sector in Southern California and also other parts of the country are kept contingent through the use of staffing agencies, seasonal employment, through racial discrimination, gender work assignments, all of which feed into the conditions that we're talking about among the 10 million or so warehouse workers in the United States. So to start, warehousing surveillance is focused on one core unit of management, the box or the case, not the person, not the worker. This tells you what they care about protecting. Every product and its ability to flow through the system is the most important thing. In turn, the worker that is related to the box at any given time, at a port terminal, driving it in a truck, moving it through a warehouse, putting it in a store, or delivering it to your house, is for that period responsible for keeping that product moving as fast as possible. The workers are evaluated, disciplined, and often compensated based on the percentage of goods that they move at the rate that the company has decided is appropriate. The goods movement sector started computerizing its freight in the 70s. By the 80s, Walmart had its own computer system complete with a satellite, tracking its products around the world. The system of tracking this stuff by the early 2000s was based at the level of the actual product or box. So we had RFID and barcodes, so you could actually track the actual product, not just the container. At that point, we'd arrived at a place where the pace of where tracking the pace of movement of the worker was possible. And workers, we started to see being disciplined, first at the level of a department or a shift, but then eventually at the level of the actual worker and how many boxes they were moving and their ability to keep up with rate. So this situation was already creating pressures on the workers in the warehouses 12 years ago when we got started organizing in this workforce. Workers were being punished for not making their rate, either individually or collectively across their shift or their department. And what that means when you're a temp worker is that you don't get called back to work at the warehouse the next day if you don't make your rate, or maybe ever. The warehouse sector was designed by the same people to create was designed by these same people to create as little permanence to these jobs as possible. High rates and churning through workers in regions like ours with large unemployed and underemployed people, the reserve army of labor, is what keeps this sector moving workers through and keeps workers moving fast and on their toes. This system of tracking is another component of how they do that. What that meant for us at the time in 2010, 2011 was significant use of piece rates, which is really the ideal for these employers. Just pay for the products when they move and don't pay when workers are spending time waiting for their next container. We worked in 2011, 12, 13 on some litigation with the California Labor Commissioner and the private bar to challenge this practice, especially at the biggest Walmart warehouses in California. And as a result, most piece rate in California was ended. Right at the same time, there was this pivot to algorithmic supervision and tracking. Maybe coincidentally, maybe not. Because at that point, 2011 is when Amazon showed up. In 2011, the first facility was established in California in San Bernardino. Like most of Amazon's fulfillment centers and sortation centers that have been built since, they were built from the ground up in a facility designed for moving and tracking freight with surveillance built in, which is really the innovation, the difference between Amazon and most of the other goods moving system. Amazon installed not just the piece-by-piece barcode and RFID tech to track every single product, but also cameras to surveil every single worker and operation department and component, so that they could track not just the barcode scanner that you were moving every product through and track how quickly you were scanning and working, but also track how you operated, how you moved, how quickly you were doing any given task. Those cameras build into a network and a huge data set that every day flows to Amazon's web servers. The work patterns of first thousands and now over 1 million people every day doing tasks. And we think includes facial recognition and other tools that Amazon is now marketing to other businesses and logistics and the private sector, as well as the public sector. Unlike other logistics companies, Amazon is a data company first and foremost. They're building a data set on their workforce. So when people get hired, in the early years of Amazon warehousing, they were told, in 5 years, your job will be done by a robot. Work hard and you'll move up and keep a position in operations. That turned out not to be true. This automation promise or threat is something that they are still developing, and I think using the data that they're collecting on every worker to be able to get closer to. And we know that's their vision. The fact that that's not happened yet has a lot of factors, but I think the data that they're collecting is really focused at the end of the day on how to automate these tasks as much as possible. What it does in the real world right now is it creates a cascade of problems. It pushes workers to move faster. Workers know that they're being surveilled, tracked, and monitored. Any slowdown could result in discipline, either by the algorithm or by a human being acting on that algorithm. What happens is you instinctively speed up. You adjust your behavior, result in faster work, higher strain, injury rates, workers trying to work through and muscle through small injuries in order to not slow down. This results in skipped bathroom breaks and other stoppages. People during COVID are not cleaning their workstations because that's considered time off task. All the different things that we do to take care of ourselves go out the window. Algorithms set these standards for the workers at different levels, but we also see that it's a moving target. Workers report making rates consistently and then seeing them go up the next day. Workers are run through stress tests, like something called the Amazon Power Hour, where workers are given some small incentive or something that the person who works the fastest gets some sort of gift if they all work at full blast for an hour straight. We believe this is a stress test, again, to see how fast the facility can be operated if people just bust ass. And we see workers being disciplined for time off task in situations like taking bathroom and COVID cleaning breaks. This led to, of course, AB 701, the bill that Assemblywoman Gonzalez was mentioning earlier. She was our champion on this bill to start addressing these issues. That was focused on the quota issue, but it also interacts with the algorithm, where managers use the algorithm as the reason that workers are disciplined. We see that 701 gives us an opportunity for workers to be able to work safely without eroding their breaks, and also protect workers who speak up in the workplace. And workers who are terminated or disciplined because of rate are given extra protections around retaliation. We believe this is a part of the solution. We believe that taking on the algorithm and looking at it from the side of how it deals with pace of work is really important. And we always tell people is what we see here in these warehouses is coming to the other sectors. This is the laboratory for these new technologies. And so the more we can do to try to stop it in the warehousing sector and the goods movement sector, we hope that it won't be marketed to the other sectors that you're dealing with, to the general public, but also to government agencies like Amazon contracts with government agencies like ICE, like police departments, even the Defense Department. So we see this as kind of the tip of the spear and a place for us to have a fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheheryar. We're going to go to our last panelist on this first panel, Doug Bloch, the Political Director of Teamsters Joint Council 7.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks to the Labor Center for having me here today, and congratulations on the great report you released this week. So I've been asked to briefly speak to the Teamsters experience with data and technology, what it's like and what we've done about it. And here's my quick version. I'm convinced that the people who talk about the robot apocalypse have it all wrong. The robots aren't coming to take our jobs, they're coming to supervise us. Not only that, they want to treat us like robots too, using technology to break down, standardize, and make a routine out of every task we do. And add to that, work arrangements that weaken worker power under the label innovation, and I can paint a very dismal picture. The good news is our experience shows that when workers join together in unions, we can actually do something about it. So let me get into our history. The Teamsters are a very diverse union. It's actually fitting I'm the last person because we work in every industry you've heard from today. At our heart, though, we are a transportation union. We started out driving teams of horses over 100 years ago, and we've adapted to every change since then. We've been actually the guinea pigs for many of the things my fellow panelists talk about. And I want to take you back to 1990. That's when United Parcel Service, the largest unionized employer in the United States with 325,000 Teamsters, introduced the DIAD, or Delivery Information Acquisition Device. The DIAD is a small handheld computer that a UPS driver gets every morning before they get in their truck. It scans barcodes, collects signatures, stores package tracking information. And by 2010, UPS added a lot more features to the DIAD, along with sensors on the trucks that tell them our vehicle location, how fast we're driving, how hard we hit the brakes, idling time, fuel consumption, even whether we have our seatbelts on or not. Supervisors can call us through the DIAD, tracks our hours, tells them how long it takes to make deliveries. It collects all this data and sends it back to management. UPS also has something called Orion, which stands for the On-Road Integrated Optimization and Navigation System. Now, anyone with a Maps program on your smartphone can understand Orion. It's an algorithm that combines maps, real-time traffic conditions, package, customer information into a platform that tells our members how to get people their stuff as quickly and as cheaply as possible. For example, Orion makes sure we don't make any left turns along the way because that takes more time and more gas. In trucking, all of this is called telematics. And used right, telematics are supposed to be good for workers, corporations, customers, and the climate. With the explosion in online shopping since the pandemic began, our members are working harder than ever, and I'm not sure they see all the benefits. In fact, the DIAD's the taskmaster. And this is where I'll also say it's about more than technology. It's also about the drive for shareholder profits, which leads to irresponsible business models of subcontracting, outsourcing, and misclassification, as people mentioned. In the gig economy, these telematics are also used to set worker wages. And with Amazon, which is UPS's largest customer, Amazon has its own telematics system that constantly monitors and supervises its drivers. Now, while the trucks we see say Amazon on the side and the drivers wear Amazon uniforms, those drivers don't directly work for Amazon. They're actually employed by thousands of small delivery service partners that Amazon contracts with to exclusively move their packages. And the same goes for Amazon's Flex service, where misclassified drivers run around in their own cars like an Uber for package delivery. These are textbook arrangements corporations use to control workers without taking any responsibility for them. They erode worker power while maximizing profits. You see, unlike a UPS driver who makes an average of $100,000 a year in California, has fully paid family health insurance and a pension, Amazon drivers make $20 an hour with unaffordable health care and no pension. And if the algorithm says an Amazon driver did something wrong, they get fired with no recourse. A UPS driver, however, is protected by our union contract, which says no driver can get fired because of surveillance technology unless they engage in dishonest behavior. A human supervisor actually has to directly observe your behavior, not an algorithm. Our members have a due process. They get a verbal warning. They have a grievance procedure. And finally, the contract says that the Teamsters can meet with UPS if we believe technology is being misused for discipline. This is important because our members are the data collectors. Over 125,000 US drivers make more than 100 deliveries per day. They are literally building the algorithm for the company. So our position is it shouldn't be used against them. Now we're going into contract negotiations with UPS next year, and how we deal with all this stuff matters. UPS could expand the dyad. They can connect it to inward and outward facing drive cameras, wearables that could track our eye and our head movements. And how are we going to prepare for autonomous vehicles? Our contract needs to stay caught up to technology, and so do government rules and regulations. And furthermore, all workers should have equal rights, not just union workers. An error with an algorithm may not be a big deal for a corporation, but for a worker, it can be catastrophic. It can mean losing your job, getting injured, or even death. Labor unions in the US rose up from the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution and the Great Depression, two pivotal moments that changed the relationship between people and their work. The rallying cry for workers was to own the means of production, because the only thing they owned was their ability to sell their labor. Workers joined together in unions and collectively negotiated higher prices for their labor, ushering in the middle class in this country. At the state's Future of Work Commission, we saw evidence that as the share of workers in unions has decreased, income inequality has increased. I believe the struggle now is for workers to join together to get a fair return for both their labor and the data they produce, and that would be true innovation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic panel. Appreciate everybody taking the time. I think you all brought something so important and interesting. So thank you so much. We're now going to turn to our second panel, which is focused on what are the right policy responses. We've now heard details of what these technologies look like in many different industries and where it feels like it's going in the workplace. What should the state of California, what should policymakers be doing to try to protect workers as work changes? We will start with Ken Wong, Policy Associate at the California Employment Lawyers Association.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm going to share my screen. I have a short slideshow. So hopefully everybody can see this. So thank you really to everybody who made it today to the webinar. And thank you so much to the Labor Center for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion on the future of work and of workers. You already heard from speakers who have described a whole host of issues raised by AI and algorithmic management in the modern workplace. And I just want to spend the next few minutes on a brief overview of how existing law addresses or overlooks these harms. It's important to understand, and I think a lot of the panelists have really driven this point home, that technological innovation that extracts ever more productivity from workers is not a new phenomenon. And there are many examples in history where workers and policymakers have risen to the challenge to confront harms to workers' rights. And what we've heard is that AI and algorithmic management exacerbates existing harms and poses new threats to workers' rights while making violations of existing labor protections harder to detect. So what are these protections? Here's a non-exhaustive list of worker protections that should address some of the harms raised by algorithmic management. And as you can tell from this chart, California has historically led the way in innovative labor protections, and we must do so again. You see, many of these laws were originally passed decades ago to address the issues of contemporary labor conditions, and none of them explicitly target AI technology. For example, the right to take collective action is a core pillar of the National Labor Relations Act, but such rights could be severely chilled or curtailed by persistent location tracking and electronic monitoring. Or how about the right to a fair day's pay guaranteed by the Fair Labor Standards Act and the California Labor Code? Well, the gigifying of our workforce has led to rampant misclassification that rob workers of basic employment guarantees. We also see some new laws on this list, such as San Francisco's Formula Retail Ordinance, protecting workers from unpredictable scheduling, such as those dictated by quote unquote smart scheduling AI that assigns work based on real-time predictions of customer traffic and weather and other factors. And before I go on much further, I have to credit how much kind of academics, researchers, and workers have really been kind of working hard to explore the ways that these existing laws govern the use of AI. And I would love to spend the next 4 hours with you going over the nuances of each law. I'll spare you by spending only a few minutes on some examples. So, starting with our anti-discrimination law. These laws come out of the civil rights movement to address the persistent discrimination that historically marginalized groups continue to experience today in civil society. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Fair Employment and Housing Act of California address discrimination at work. So when an employer adopts a hiring test, for example, to find new workers, the test should only measure characteristics that are job-related. Theoretically, this should protect workers from being measured by arbitrary metrics, or worse, excluded because of insidious discrimination against a protected characteristic, such as one's race, sex, or national origin. But as you all know, this ideal has been hard to realize, and some AI tools have exacerbated this problem. Take Facebook's job ads, which has given the option for employers to customize the audience for recruitment ads, including the option to explicitly exclude older applicants based on their age. And after these ads are posted, the algorithms controlling who sees these job ads have shown persistent gender bias. So if you're a potential applicant, you would never have known about being discriminated against for a job opportunity because you were never shown the opportunity to begin with. Other AI-driven hiring platforms perpetuate workplace discrimination by helping to replicate existing workforce demographics. These tools collect massive amounts of information on an applicant in order to make recommendations about who to hire, and it does so by analyzing quote unquote successful workers in a current workforce and drawing inferences about what makes them successful. If the existing workforce is mostly white and male, then the AI may assume that being white and male are what makes you successful and therefore recommend more white men for the job. Beyond anti-discrimination law, our federal and state health and safety laws also provide important safeguards to workers. So how do these standards apply in this context? Take, for example, the sanitation standards of OSHA regulation, which protects a worker's ability to use the bathroom at work. And while some may consider technologies such as AI-driven quotas as common workplace productivity tools, these quotas have made something as basic as using bathrooms at work a technically achievable but practically impossible feat by penalizing the time as time off task. Thankfully, AB 701 in California will help to address this issue. Another example is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to workers with disabilities. And a worker with a disability could request an accommodation to alter a punishing work pace. However, productivity goals dictated by AI makes this individualized process difficult and impersonal. Aside from legacy labor protections addressing discrimination and health and safety, California has also enacted important protections to safeguard personal information of Californians. In 2018, California passed the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, a landmark legislation that gives consumers some control over the personal information that companies collect about them. So why is the CCPA included in a presentation about worker protections? Well, the act defines consumers broadly enough to include people who perform work in California. And currently, employees and independent contractors are carved out from these protections until January 1st of 2023. And that's except for a limited right to request that personal information that a business collects from them. So while this legislation is a historic first step in protecting consumer privacy, it falls short in several ways. First, as the name suggests, the focus of the law is to safeguard against harms to privacy. This is not a useful framework to regulate the harms faced by workers at work, which goes much beyond privacy. Second, a worker's relationship to their boss is very different from a consumer's relationship to a business. Take consent, for example. It would be almost impossible for a worker to withhold consent over data collection if such collection was made a condition of their employment. Imagine seeing a pop-up ad at work in which asks whether you want to opt out of collection and therefore opt out of your job. And finally, the CCPA is supposed to be enforced by the Attorney General of California, which likely only has limited resources to devote to enforcing labor laws. So where does that leave us? Well, based on what you've heard from the panelists already today, I hope you can agree that we need a new framework to protect workers' rights in the age of algorithmic management. This is because the little data rights that we have focuses on privacy, which is an inadequate framework. Existing law also only offered limited protections, and AI is making harms harder to detect and rights more difficult to enforce. And piecemeal legislation to address specific harms posed by AI management may be beneficial in the short run, such as Illinois' Biometric Information Privacy Act or San Francisco's Fair Scheduling Ordinance, but a comprehensive regulatory regime is needed to fully remedy all potential harms. And this is why I'm really excited to be here today, and especially to hear from the brilliant folks at the Labor Center about the key principles and rights that we should consider in a comprehensive worker data rights framework. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was a great presentation. We are going to turn now to Annette Bernhardt, who has created this entire program for us today, and one of the authors of the report that the UC Berkeley Labor Center put out. She is the Director of Technology and Worker Project at UC Berkeley Labor Center. Annette.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And this is just, it has been incredible listening to all of you and really tell the stories about how these technologies really hit the ground and impact workers. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the principles that we lay out in the report, and I want to make sure to acknowledge my two excellent co-authors, Lisa Kresge and Reem Suleiman, who contributed deeply to the report. I'll be focusing on the solution, but I wanted to lift up a couple of themes from what my colleagues have shared with you. And one is just to stress how many different sectors are starting to use these technologies. Definitely the industries you all heard about today, but also industries like call centers, like retail stores, janitorial and security services, restaurants, construction, domestic work, the public sector, you name it. And so this is really an economy-wide trend. And while I would say we're still somewhat in the early stages of it, especially with COVID, we are seeing rapid adoption in a whole range of industries. The other thing I wanted to lift up is, as Ken stressed, that the harms here to workers extend far beyond privacy. In the report, we collate and walk through a whole number of them. They include discrimination, work intensification, health and safety harms, de-skilling and job loss, lower wages and less economic mobility, contingent work, suppression of the right to organize, loss of privacy, and then also importantly, loss of autonomy and dignity. So workers clearly have very big stakes in these technologies and how they are implemented in the workplace. I want to echo, though, what Assemblywoman Gonzalez said, which is that we are not saying that technology is inherently bad. Far from it. You can imagine any number of ways that technology could be used to make jobs safer, to expand access to work, to enable workers to grow their skills and build their careers. But it is very clear to us that we are going to need baseline regulation of these technologies to ensure that workers benefit from and are not harmed by them. So in short, we need technology rights for workers. And importantly, we argue that these rights should be thought of as 21st century labor standards. So we decided in the last century that we were going to set labor standards in the US labor market. We passed minimum wage laws, we passed workplace health and safety laws, we established the right to organize, we passed anti-discrimination laws. We think of worker technology rights in exactly the same way, that they should be the labor standards for the 21st century, both in public policy and in collective bargaining. So what would those labor standards look like? In our report, you will see that we laid out a detailed set of policy principles to regale you. I will only be able to give a brief overview, but the thing I want to make sure you know is that that policy framework is the result of a lot of input by a lot of folks, including worker advocates, employment lawyers, and privacy experts, many of whom are here today, as well as our research and other people's research on concepts in other countries, particularly the EU, which is years ahead of the US in terms of starting to establish oversight over new tech. So this is really a collective effort. So first, principles. Much of the same way we think about labor standards in our current laws, the goal of new public policies should be to ensure worker dignity and welfare in the use of data-driven technologies. All workers deserve protection, whether they're employees or subcontracted workers or independent contractors or remote workers or job applicants. These standards need to be universal. Similarly, all employers should be held to the same standards, including, importantly, their labor subcontractors and their technology vendors. And then very important is that any employment-related decision made or assisted by data-driven technologies should be regulated. And the reason this is so important is that because it's really when employers use technology to make decisions like hiring, job assignments, promotions, disciplining, that we see the actual impact on workers. We then move to disclosure, and disclosure and transparency are always important in public policy, but they are especially critical because, as we've heard, these new technologies are often hidden from both workers and policymakers. And without disclosure, job applicants won't know, for example, like Ken said, if a hiring algorithm is assessing their resume and what it's looking for, or drivers won't know when and where they're being tracked by GPS. So disclosure really is the bedrock of effective regulation. And so the principles here are that workers should be given prior notice about the use of data-driven technologies that affect them. Notices should be accessible and include detail on the worker data being collected and any electronic monitoring or algorithms being used. Notices should document how employment-related decisions could be affected. This is critical that workers understand the potential consequences of the technologies that employers are notifying them about. And then notices should be filed with regulatory agencies as a form of basic documentation. Next is worker data. And just to reiterate, right now, employers can collect or buy vast amount of data on their workers and share it or sell it without restriction. But that kind of unlimited collection of data really exposes workers to risk, whether it's data breaches or employers misusing what is often very sensitive personal information. So exactly like consumers, workers deserve clear standards on employers' collection and use of their data. In particular, employers should only collect worker data that's necessary and essential for workers to do their jobs. Workers should have the right to access, correct, and download their data. Employers should not be allowed to sell worker data. And here we are defining worker data broadly to include personal identity data, biometric and health information, data related to workplace activities, and online information such as social media activity. Next is electronic monitoring, and I think I don't need to stress here how incredibly invasive this technology can be, and that there is significant potential for misuse. So in our minds, this is really one of the most important areas for strong guardrails. And the principles here are that employers should only use electronic monitoring for limited purposes that do not harm workers. Productivity monitoring in particular should be reviewed by regulatory agencies for health and safety impacts. And that's because the risk for negative impacts on workers is so high, as we've heard from in the warehouse example. Employers should not be allowed to use electronic monitoring in sensitive areas like bathrooms, or if it's based on high-risk technologies such as facial recognition. And you've probably already heard that a host of cities are starting to ban the use of facial recognition at all. It should not be in the workplace either. And then very important, electronic monitoring should not be used as a substitute for human decision-making, especially when it comes to decisions like hiring, firing, promotion, and discipline. There is just too much room for error and incomplete information coming from electronic monitoring. Employers shouldn't only or even mainly rely on electronic monitoring. And then if a decision is informed by the electronic monitoring, workers should get full documentation and be able to challenge it. It's similar for algorithms, which again, many of these algorithmic technologies are opaque, they're untested. They're often being used by employers with little understanding of their potential impacts on workers. So we really need strong guardrails here. Just like we're starting to demand accountability in the powerful algorithms used by social media companies, in the same way we need accountability from employers when they use these systems. So employers should not use algorithms that harm worker health or safety or well-being. Productivity algorithms, again, should be reviewed by regulatory agencies because of their high risk of impacting workers negatively. Employers should not use algorithms to make irrelevant or unfair predictions about workers, like whether a worker might get pregnant or whether a worker might try to organize a union. Employers should be prohibited from using high risk technologies like facial recognition. And then very important, algorithms should not be used to automate consequential employment-related decisions. This is very important because I do think one of the dangers here, and Doug foreshadowed this, is that increasingly algorithms will take over more and more and more of the decisions in workplaces. I'm not making the argument that humans are good at making decisions. We are obviously not great at it. But if everything is automated, workers don't even get a chance to have a voice or even a chance to challenge decisions. And so yes, if a decision is informed by algorithms, workers should get full documentation and be able to challenge it. And then closely related to this is impact assessments. The fact that so many of these technologies are black boxes really means that the impact on workers is not self-evident. And it's not fair to workers to wait until the harms occur to address them. So data-driven technologies should be regularly evaluated with impact assessments, and harms must be mitigated. Workers should have input into those assessments and be able to challenge them. Impact assessments should evaluate the full range of potential harms to workers, not just some narrow measures. And again, discrimination, harms to mental health, harms to physical health, loss of privacy, negative economic impacts. We really need to take a broad understanding of potential effects on workers. And then impact assessments should be filed with regulatory agencies. Finally, cutting across all of the above that I just walked through are three very important pillars. A key one, obviously, is anti-discrimination and is absolutely critical here. Data-driven technologies should not discriminate against workers based on race, gender, and other protected characteristics. Workers should have the right to organize around technology, and employers should not use electronic monitoring or algorithms to suppress organizing. And then last, enforcement is absolutely critical, especially given how new and fast changing these technologies are. So regulatory agencies should play a strong enforcement role, and workers should have recourse when they are harmed. So that was a very fast blaze through the policy framework and the report, and I encourage folks listening to go to the report itself to get more detail. I want to make very clear, you know, these principles are just a starting point. There is a lot to discuss how they should be implemented. There's a lot to discuss about what additional safeguards are needed. I think a big challenge for policymakers will be how quickly these technologies change. And so we need to figure out approaches that are nimble enough to adapt to new systems. But I also want to leave you with a final thought, which is that as important as labor standards are, they are just the beginning. And ultimately, what we really want is that workers should participate fully in technological change. And that's because workers have a wealth of knowledge and experience to bring to the table. And we will all benefit if we draw on that knowledge and experience. And so workers should participate in decisions over which technologies are developed. They should participate in decisions about how they're used in the workplace. And they should definitely have a say in how the resulting productivity gains are shared. That is how we make sure that technology works for workers. Thank you so much.